I think it's safe to say at this point that Pixar has sort of been on the back foot when it comes to making movies these days. Don't get me wrong, a lot of their films are still really good, and a few even managed to get me as emotionally invested as their older works, but they've also begun to fall into the corporate trap of putting making money before making art. Just look at how many franchise films and bland, lifeless originals they've been putting out lately, and you'll see exactly what I mean. And when I first saw the trailer for this gender-bent Fireboy and Water Girl adaptation, I thought it would be just a cliche and extremely mediocre attempt at a romantic comedy, with the lack of real quality marketing not really raising my hopes. Nonetheless, I saw Elemental day one so I could avoid any spoilers or reviews, and I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. While definitely flawed in many areas, I thought it was a pretty cute film, and I had a surprisingly good time with it. To start off, I have to give Elemental this. The animation in this movie is really, really good, and a lot of the scenes here are stunning to look at. I do not envy the nightmare the animators probably had to endure in order to animate these water and fire people. But to say that the animation was completely groundbreaking and out of this world would be a bit exaggerated, since there wasn't really anything here as visually striking as either of the Spider-Verse films, or as creative and beautiful with its use of these elements as in Avatar: The Last Airbender or in Demon Slayer. But this isn't really a big problem for me, since it would have been a lot harder to have such striking visuals for these semi-humanoids, so it's still really good, especially by Pixar standards. However, I couldn't help but notice that the city that these elements live in didn't really seem like it was a world that wasn't already inhabited by humans. I mean, there was an arena that played an air-specific sport, and the train in and out of the city is on a track that was basically a water slide, but apart from that there wasn't really anything that seemed overly fantastical or non-human to me. Compare that to movies like Zootopia or Robots, which have huge locations that absolutely have had time and thought put into how they would function without humans and what they can do to really work with the concept they've been given. And you can sort of see what I mean when I say that there's been missed opportunities. I mean, you have a society that was made entirely by water people before any of the other elements showed up, and yet there's not really anything water exclusive about the architecture or design of the city that they live in. Instead, it feels more like the world from Cars, where every now and again there's a car version of a human thing, but it's mostly just a human world that sentient cars just happen to live in. And the same rings true here, since it seems like the water people didn't create the city for themselves, but rather just found it and worked around it like the other elements do. Another thing that I actually did enjoy from this movie was the romance between main protagonists Ember and Wade, which I was shocked to find myself actually getting invested in as the movie went on. Sure, it was a little cliche and cheesy at times, but I do appreciate that the writers actually bothered to create real chemistry between the two and show their feelings blossom and grow as they interacted more throughout the movie, rather than just having them go from various scene to scene with very little interaction, then have the film proclaim right at the very end, they were in love the whole time. Though I gotta say that like many, I'm getting real tired of that overused trope in romance movies, both animated and live action, where the two main characters get in some argument over some lie or some truth or something else that's dumb, and it causes the two to break up in a really overdramatic way. Well, yeah, occasionally it is done well with some actual emotion to it. Here, it just felt really forced and lame though. Like, I'll go into more detail about it in a bit, but for now, they were sharing this really sweet and emotional scene, and then just completely out of nowhere, the two started fighting over absolutely nothing, and the time I was spending actually enjoying this film quickly came to an end and never really came back. Which reminds me, what an awful climax. I thought the damn plotline was alright and a good way to get the two to interact and bond with one another, but they really needed to drop this plotline instead of bringing it back every time this movie needed some sort of conflict. Instead of having a more grounded and emotional climax between these two, where they realize that they were both being ridiculous and forgive one another, this movie decides to go for an energyless and generic disaster scenario which forces the two to work together, which you've probably seen in a dozen other, probably better films. A major problem for me with this movie was that there were a lot of interesting ideas and concepts that got presented here as the film went along, but very few of them actually got developed and instead were just dropped as soon as it was time for the film to move on to the next big set piece or the next forgettable character. I mean, at the beginning you had this really compelling story of these two fire immigrants trying to make a new life in a city that was extremely dangerous to them, while regularly facing prejudice for being fire people, only for them to build their own business and help usher in a thriving community of fire people all around them. And honestly, I would have much rather watch a whole movie about that than the romantic comedy that only pays lip service to these ideas. Though I also did really like the relationship between Ember and her dad Bernie, and seeing them bond and have fun with each other when Ember was a little kid was so cute. Hell, even when she's an adult, their relationship is super sweet, and seeing her desire to help him out with running the store in his old age was really heartwarming and set up an idea I rarely see in films that was genuinely interesting. The feeling of needing to repay some debt to your family for everything they sacrificed to raise you and give you a better life, even at the cost of your own happiness. Unlike many other ideas in this movie, this one actually is relevant to the plot and is developed, though I do wish that we got to see her own passions and her talent for glassmaking art earlier, and see her conflicting emotions about it sooner. But I'd be lying if I said that the big argument that Ember and her dad have, and the whole liar revealed trope in general, was really contrived and dumb here. I mean, I get where they're both coming from since she did lie about the store's pipes and her accidental breaking of them, but I think that Bernie way overreacts to this information, especially since at the time of the scene, the problem had already been fixed, even if it didn't stay fixed for long. Also, throughout this whole movie, we see Bernie talk about not wanting to be watered down and not trusting the water people, which there were valid reasons for him not trusting them. But suddenly at the end, he's just okay with his daughter dating a water person. It kind of just comes out of nowhere, and I wish that they had given him some sort of arc where he overcomes his water racism, or even just a scene where he has some kind of positive interaction with Wade as Ember's boyfriend, rather than just the lame food inspector bit like halfway through the movie. However, there is a much bigger problem for me with this film, and in order to properly discuss it, I need to go into some heavy details, so if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp. So, the biggest problem for me, the one that I was alluding to earlier in this review, was that Ember and Wade actually are able to touch, despite being fire and water. And to me, this is such a lazy cop-out. This whole movie, we see moments where the fire people are touched by water and entire parts of them go out in an instant. But when they touch a water person, all that happens is a light sizzle and a mild boil in the water person. It would have been so much better to me if, during the scene where they actually do try to touch to see if their relationship could work, they do actually get hurt and realize that they can't touch, but then decide to try and persevere and work their relationship around this fact. Imagine how much better the scene where they finally dance with one another would be if, after hurting themselves from touching, they place their hands about an inch away from each other and then begin to adapt and move in sync with each other so they can dance without even touching. That would have been such a simple yet so creative and beautiful change, and it might have even been the best scene in the entire movie. Hell, the writers could have still had their big argument scene, only here it would have actually been validated since they have something to argue over and Ember has a reason to think their love couldn't work since they can't even touch each other. As is though, it's an okay scene that is very pretty to look at, but kinda gets worse the more you think about it, which is kinda like the movie as a whole. There's something else I thought that would make this movie way better was this. A lot of my problems stem from the fact that there are just too many plot lines and ideas here, and not a lot of them were very well thought out nor get a lot of screen time in an hour and a half. So maybe this would have just worked way better as a simpler 8 to 10 minute short film like Pixar's Bao and Day and Night, which are both far more visually striking and emotionally impactful in that time with absolutely no words at all. I don't know. I just can't help but think that this idea of sentient elements interacting together wasn't developed that well here, and to me it kind of seems like it's just because there just wasn't really much to work with beyond the whole fire and water thing. So why not work with just that? It may seem like I'm being very negative to this movie, but I did like it, I swear. I just didn't think it was as amazing as some of Pixar's previous works, and I think that there was a lot that could have been done to make it a better film overall, even if it meant simplifying the story and potentially even losing the feature length. I would definitely watch it again sometime with some friends, but honestly, if I want to watch a truly great romance story with gorgeous animation made by Pixar, I would just rewatch WALL-E for the 1000th time. But I was overall pleasantly surprised by this, and you might be too. I feel like this is a solid 6 out of 10, though it honestly could lower a bit on rewatch. But I'm not too disappointed by this, since there are plenty of other animated films coming out this year that'll probably be better, so stay tuned for many more reviews to come.